Eleanor Jenkins had worked at the Montgomery mansion for over 30 years. Each morning, she arrived at 6, before the rest of the house stirred to life. The old mansion, with its polished wooden floors and high ceilings, had become more familiar to her than her own modest home across town. Today was like any other day. Eleanor placed her worn handbag in the small closet off the kitchen and tied her apron around her waist. At 62, her movements were slower than when she first started, but her eyes missed nothing. The morning light streamed through the tall windows as she moved through the quiet rooms with practiced ease. Richard Montgomery had built his fortune in real estate when he was barely 30. Now in his 60s, with silver hair and a perpetual frown, he owned half the buildings in the downtown area. From humble beginnings, he had climbed to the very top, with determination and a sharp mind for business. But life at the top was lonely. His wife had left 15 years ago, taking their only son with her to Europe. The mansion that had once echoed with laughter now felt cold and empty. Eleanor knew more about Richard than anyone else. She knew he took his coffee black with 1 sugar, that he suffered from back pain but refused to see a doctor, and that sometimes late at night, she would find him in his study looking at old family photos. They rarely spoke beyond necessary exchanges, yet a strange kind of understanding had formed between them over the decades. "Morning, Eleanor," Richard mumbled, walking into the kitchen in his robe while checking his phone. He didn't look up. "Good morning, Mr. Montgomery. Your breakfast is on the table and I've pressed your blue suit for the meeting today." Eleanor placed a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of him. He nodded, already lost in his emails. Eleanor poured his coffee and continued with her chores. This was their routine, comfortable in its predictability. Richard Montgomery's wealth had grown steadily over the years. His company, Montgomery Properties, had transformed the city skyline with gleaming office buildings and luxury apartments. The local papers called him a visionary, but Eleanor had overheard enough conversations to know that many deals came at a cost to others. Neighborhoods changed hands, old buildings came down, and families moved away. Business was business, as Richard often said during his phone calls. Eleanor had her own quiet ways of keeping tabs on the outside world. Her nephew worked at City Hall and would sometimes mention Montgomery Properties in their Sunday phone calls. Her church friends lived in various parts of the city and shared stories about changing neighborhoods. Eleanor listened and remembered everything, though she never spoke about her employer's business to anyone. The mansion staff had dwindled over the years. The gardener came twice a week, and a young man cleaned the pool on Fridays. Eleanor was the only one who remained full-time, handling the cooking, cleaning, and laundry. She moved through the large house like a shadow, noticing everything but rarely being noticed herself. This invisibility gave Eleanor a unique perspective. Visitors to the mansion, business partners, potential clients, lawyers, and politicians spoke freely in her presence as if she were part of the furniture. They discussed deals, shared secrets, and sometimes revealed their true characters when they thought no one important was listening. "Eleanor, I'll be having guests for dinner tomorrow night," Richard announced, finally looking up from his phone. 4 people, very important clients. "Something special, please." "Yes, sir, I'll prepare the dining room and make your favorite roast." Eleanor knew this meant a big deal was in the works. Richard only used the formal dining room for significant business occasions. That evening, as Eleanor was preparing to leave, she noticed Richard in his study, surrounded by papers and looking unusually tense. She hesitated at the doorway, wondering if she should ask if he needed anything before she left. "Is everything all right, Mr. Montgomery?" The words slipped out before she could stop herself. In 30 years, she had rarely inquired about his personal matters. Richard looked up, surprised by the question. For a moment, his professional mask slipped, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of uncertainty in his eyes. "Just business, Eleanor. A new opportunity, bigger than anything I've done before." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "But bigger risks, too." Eleanor nodded, not expecting him to say more. "I'll make sure everything is perfect for your dinner tomorrow." "Thank you, Eleanor." He paused, then added, "You've been here longer than anyone. Sometimes I think you know this place better than I do." It was the most personal thing he had said to her in years. Eleanor smiled slightly and wished him good night. The next day, Eleanor arrived early to prepare for the dinner. She polished the silver, arranged fresh flowers from the garden, and prepared Richard's favorite dishes. By 6 o'clock, everything was ready. Eleanor changed into her formal black dress and white apron that she wore for special occasions. At 7 sharp, the doorbell rang. Eleanor opened the door to find 4 men in expensive suits. The first 3 were familiar, local businessmen who had visited before, but the 4th was a stranger, tall and confident with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Welcome to the Montgomery residence," Eleanor greeted them politely, taking their coats. Richard appeared in the hallway, all business now, shaking hands and leading his guests to the living room for drinks. Eleanor served them quietly, placing appetizers on the side table and ensuring their glasses stayed full. "Gentlemen, this deal will change everything," Richard was saying. "The Riverside project is exactly what this city needs." The stranger, who introduced himself as James Barrett, spoke with authority about technology centers, modern infrastructure, and unprecedented growth. Eleanor noticed how the others deferred to him, even Richard. There was something about Barrett that made Eleanor uneasy, though she couldn't quite place why. As she served dinner, Eleanor overheard fragments of conversation about acquiring land, zoning changes, and potential resistance from certain communities. Barrett spoke of similar projects in other cities, describing how initial opposition always faded once people saw the benefits. "The key is moving quickly," Barrett said, cutting into his steak. "Once the papers are signed, we start immediately, before anyone can organize against it." Richard nodded thoughtfully. Eleanor had seen that look before, the excitement of a new challenge mixed with the caution of a businessman who had weathered many storms. Throughout the evening, Eleanor noticed how Barrett would glance at her occasionally, his eyes assessing and dismissive. Once, when she was refilling his water glass, he stopped mid-sentence and waited for her to leave before continuing, as if suddenly remembering she was there. The dinner lasted until nearly midnight. As the guests prepared to leave, Barrett placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. "I'll send the contracts over tomorrow. We should finalize everything by the end of the week." After they left, Eleanor began clearing the table. Richard remained seated, swirling the last of his whiskey in his glass, lost in thought. "They seemed very eager, sir," Eleanor said as she stacked the plates. Richard looked up, almost surprised, to find her still there. "Yes. It's a major deal, Eleanor. Could be the biggest of my career." Eleanor nodded and continued her work, but something felt wrong. In all her years working for Richard Montgomery, she had developed a sense for when things weren't quite right. The excitement in Richard's voice couldn't hide the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes didn't quite meet hers. That night, as Eleanor drove home to her small apartment on the east side of town, her mind kept returning to the dinner, conversation. Riverside, that was where her sister lived, in one of the oldest neighborhoods in the city. Whatever this project was, it seemed it might affect people she knew and cared about. Eleanor pulled into her driveway, turned off the engine, and sat in silence for a moment. For 30 years, she had kept her work and personal life separate. She had witnessed countless deals from the shadows, never interfering, never questioning. But something about this one felt different. For the first time, Eleanor wondered if her loyalty should lie with the man who signed her paychecks, or with the community that had raised her. With a deep sigh, she gathered her things and headed inside. Tomorrow would bring more cleaning, more cooking, more silent observation. But perhaps this time Eleanor Jenkins would do more than just watch from the sidelines. The morning after the dinner, Eleanor arrived at the Montgomery mansion to find Richard already awake and on the phone, in his study. His voice carried down the hallway as she hung up her coat. "Yes, Barrett, I understand the timeline." "No, I haven't reviewed all the documents yet." "Yes, I know opportunity doesn't wait." Eleanor moved quietly past the study door, catching a glimpse of Richard pacing back and forth, his free hand rubbing the back of his neck, a sure sign he was under pressure. She headed to the kitchen and began preparing his breakfast, the familiar routine calming her racing thoughts about the previous night's conversation. 20 minutes later, Richard appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking tired, despite the early hour. His usually crisp appearance was slightly rumpled, as if he'd been up most of the night. "I'll take breakfast in the study today, Eleanor," he said, checking his watch. "And cancel my other appointments. Barrett is sending his team over, with the contract drafts this afternoon." Eleanor nodded, hiding her surprise. Richard never canceled appointments, especially not for same-day meetings. This Barrett person clearly had a strong hold on him. "Would you like me to prepare lunch for your meeting, sir?" she asked. "Yes, something simple. 4 people. He turned to leave, then paused. "And Eleanor, these people, they're very important. This deal could change everything." There was something in his voice, not just excitement, but a hint of uncertainty. In 30 years, Eleanor had learned to read the subtle shifts in Richard's demeanor. Something about this deal was different. Throughout the morning, Eleanor went about her usual tasks while keeping an ear out for Richard's phone conversations. He rarely left his study, and when delivery people arrived with thick envelopes marked confidential, he answered the door himself, rather than letting Eleanor handle it as usual. At precisely 1 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Eleanor opened it, to find James Barrett standing there with 3 other people, a young woman carrying a laptop and 2 men with briefcases. "Mrs. Jenkins, isn't it?" Barrett said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Eleanor was surprised he remembered her name. Most visitors never bothered. "Ms. Jenkins," she corrected gently, stepping aside to let them in. "Mr. Montgomery is expecting you in the main sitting room." Barrett nodded dismissively and strode past her, his team following closely behind. Eleanor showed them to the sitting room where Richard was waiting, then retreated to prepare the lunch trays. As she worked in the kitchen, she could hear the muffled sound of voices from the sitting room, occasionally rising before dropping again to inaudible levels. When Eleanor entered with the lunch trays, the conversation abruptly stopped. Papers were quickly gathered and turned over. Barrett gave Richard a pointed look before smiling at Eleanor. "Thank you," he said, his tone making it clear she should leave immediately after setting down the food. Eleanor placed the trays on the side table and began to arrange the plates when she overheard a fragment of conversation that made her hands pause momentarily. "The community disruption is minimal compared to the potential gain," the woman with the laptop was saying, her voice low but clear. "We've handled similar situations in Oakland and Detroit. The residents will be compensated fairly," one of the men added. "Those who make noise can be dealt with through the usual channels." Eleanor kept her face neutral as she finished arranging the lunch, but her mind was racing. Riverside, where her sister lived, was a tight-knit community. Many families had been there for generations. What kind of disruption were they planning? "Eleanor, that will be all," Richard said, noticing her lingering presence. "We'll call if we need anything else." She nodded and left the room, closing the door behind her. Instead of returning to the kitchen, however, she paused in the hallway, her heart pounding. In 30 years of service, Eleanor had never eavesdropped on her employer's meetings. But the mention of community disruption, combined with Barrett's dismissive attitude, set off alarm bells she couldn't ignore. Eleanor moved silently to the small alcove near the sitting room, where a heating vent carried sounds from one room to another, something she'd discovered years ago when cleaning. From this spot, she could hear most of what was being said inside. "The environmental assessment is just a formality," Barrett was saying. "I have connections at the agency who can expedite the process." "And what about the contamination reports from your previous project?" Richard asked, his voice carrying a rare note of concern. "Overblown," Barrett replied dismissively. "A few activists making noise. It was settled quietly." "At what cost?" Richard pressed. "Less than what we made in the first month of operation," Barrett said with a laugh that sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. "Look, Richard, every major development faces opposition. What matters is how quickly and decisively we move past it." The conversation shifted to financial projections, with numbers being thrown around that made Eleanor's head spin. Millions, tens of millions potential profits that dwarfed anything she could imagine. No wonder Richard was interested. The key is getting the zoning changed before anyone realizes what's happening, Barrett continued. My contact on the city council assures me it won't be a problem. Wilson? Richard asked. I didn't know he had that kind of influence. Let's just say he's highly motivated to help us, Barrett replied with another cold laugh. He has aspirations beyond city council, and we can be very helpful to ambitious politicians. Eleanor frowned, her unease growing. Councilman Wilson represented Riverside and the surrounding neighborhoods. He had campaigned on protecting these historic communities. The meeting continued for another hour, with discussions about timelines, financing, and potential obstacles. Eleanor moved away occasionally to avoid suspicion, returning to catch fragments of conversation. What emerged was a picture that troubled her deeply, a massive commercial development that would transform Riverside, displacing residents and potentially causing environmental problems that Barrett seemed determined to minimize or ignore. When the group finally emerged from the sitting room, Eleanor was busy in the kitchen, her face composed despite the turmoil inside her. She heard Richard walking his guests to the door, Barrett's confident voice carrying through the house. We'll need your signature by Friday, Richard. The other investors are ready to move, with or without Montgomery properties. After they left, Eleanor waited for Richard to return to his study before cleaning up the sitting room. As she gathered the lunch plates, she noticed a document left behind on the floor, partially hidden under the sofa. She picked it up, intending to return it to Richard when the heading caught her eye. Riverside Community Assessment, Displacement Projections. Eleanor's hand trembled as her eyes scanned the page. The clinical language couldn't disguise the human cost. Hundreds of families would be forced to relocate, many of whom had lived in the area for decades. Property values would be artificially depressed before acquisition to minimize compensation costs. The historic church where Eleanor had been baptized was labeled Structure Tau 37, scheduled for demolition. The sound of Richard's footsteps in the hallway made Eleanor quickly fold the paper and slip it into her apron pocket. She resumed gathering the plates, her heart pounding. They left a mess, Richard remarked as he entered the room, looking around at the scattered coffee cups and napkins. Nothing I can't handle, sir, Eleanor replied, keeping her voice steady. Will you be dining at home tonight? Richard nodded absently, his mind clearly elsewhere. Barrett is moving fast. Too fast, maybe. He wasn't really talking to Eleanor, more thinking aloud as he sometimes did when preoccupied. The Riverside project sounds significant, Eleanor ventured, testing the waters. Richard looked at her in surprise, as if just remembering she was in the room. Yes, it would be the largest development in the city's history. A technology center, luxury housing, retail space. It would transform that old neighborhood completely. I have family in Riverside, Eleanor said quietly. For a moment, Richard seemed genuinely taken aback. In 30 years, they had rarely discussed Eleanor's personal life. Oh, I didn't realize? My sister and her husband, they've lived there for 40 years. Their church, too. Eleanor continued gathering dishes, not meeting Richard's eyes. An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. Progress always comes with change, Eleanor. The residents will be compensated. Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to speak further. She carried the tray of dishes to the kitchen, the document burning a hole in her pocket. That evening, after finishing her duties, Eleanor drove not to her own home but to Riverside, to her sister's small house with its carefully tended garden. Patty welcomed her with surprise. Weeknight visits were unusual. Everything okay, Ellie? Patty asked as they sat at her kitchen table, the familiar smell of cinnamon and coffee filling the air. Eleanor hesitated. For decades, she had kept her work and personal life separate, never discussing Richard Montgomery's business with anyone. But now, with her sister's home and community at stake, that separation seemed impossible to maintain. I need to ask you something, Patty. Have you heard anything about a new development project in Riverside, something big? Patty's brow furrowed. There have been rumors. Councilman Wilson held a meeting last month talking about economic opportunities and urban renewal. Why? Eleanor chose her words carefully. I may have heard something at work, something that could affect the neighborhood. For the next hour, the sisters talked. Eleanor didn't reveal the document in her pocket or mention Barrett by name, but she shared enough of her concerns to leave Patty worried. They can't just come in and take our homes, can they? Patty asked, her voice rising. With anxiety, I don't know, Eleanor admitted, but people with money and connections can do a lot of things that don't seem possible. As Eleanor drove home later that night, her mind was in turmoil. For 30 years, she had been the perfect employee, discreet, reliable, and uninvolved in Richard Montgomery's business affairs. Now, for the first time, she found herself caught between loyalty to her employer and concern for her community. The document in her apron pocket felt heavy with the weight of decision. Should she return it quietly and pretend she never saw it? Should she make copies? Should she warn more people in Riverside? And what about Richard himself? Eleanor had watched him build his empire, had seen his ruthlessness in business, but also moments of unexpected kindness. Would he really go through with a deal that would hurt so many people if he knew the full truth? As she pulled into her driveway, Eleanor made a decision. The next few days would determine not just the fate of Riverside, but also her own role in this unfolding drama. After 30 years in the shadows, Eleanor Jenkins was about to step into the light, and she wasn't sure if either she or Richard Montgomery was ready for what would happen next. Eleanor barely slept that night. The document from Barrett's meeting lay on her kitchen table, its contents troubling her more each time she reviewed it. By morning, dark circles shadowed her eyes, but her resolve had strengthened. She needed to know more. About Barrett, about the Riverside project, and about what Richard Montgomery might be getting himself into. When she arrived at the mansion, Richard was already gone, a hastily scribbled note informing her he had an early breakfast meeting with Barrett and wouldn't return until afternoon. Eleanor felt a strange sense of relief. This would give her time. After completing her morning chores, Eleanor did something she had never done before. She entered Richard's study without being invited. The large room with its dark wood paneling and leather furniture had always been his private domain. Standing in the doorway, she hesitated, her heart pounding. What she was about to do crossed a line she had respected for 3 decades. This isn't just about my job anymore, she whispered to herself, stepping into the room. Eleanor moved to Richard's desk, her experienced eyes quickly scanning the organized surface. A folder labeled Riverside Development Preliminary Contracts sat prominently in the center. With trembling hands, she opened it. The documents inside confirmed her worst fears. Page after page detailed the plans for Riverside. Not just a technology center, but a complete transformation that would erase the existing community. Maps showed the current homes, churches, and small businesses marked for demolition. Timelines indicated an aggressive schedule, with resident notifications planned for after the contracts were signed, giving people minimal time to organize or respond. What troubled Eleanor most was a section titled Community Resistance Mitigation. It outlined strategies for dealing with protests or legal challenges, including using media connections to portray opponents as anti-progress and leveraging political relationships to fast-track approvals before resistance could build. As she carefully returned the papers to their original position, a business card fell from between the pages. James Barrett, CEO, Vanguard Development Corp. Eleanor slipped the card into her pocket, replacing the folder exactly as she had found it. She left the study, closing the door behind her, and returned to the kitchen. Her hands shook as she prepared lunch, her mind racing. She needed to know more about Barrett and his company. But how? The answer came in the form of her nephew, Thomas, who worked in the records department at City Hall. Eleanor rarely asked him for favors related to his job, but today was different. During her lunch break, she called him from her car, parked a block away from the mansion. "Aunt Ellie, everything okay?" Thomas sounded surprised by the midday call. "I need a favor, Thomas," Eleanor said, keeping her voice low despite being alone. "There's a company called Vanguard Development. They're planning something big in Riverside. I need to know if they've done projects elsewhere, if there have been any problems." Thomas hesitated. That's not really public information, Aunt Ellie. Why are you asking? It affects your mother's home, Eleanor replied simply. And many others. After a moment of silence, Thomas sighed. I can't promise anything, but I'll see what I can find. Give me until tomorrow. Eleanor thanked him and ended the call, feeling both guilty for involving her nephew and relieved to have some help. As she drove back to the mansion, her mind turned to another potential source of information, the internet. Eleanor wasn't particularly tech-savvy, but she knew enough to conduct a basic search. After returning to work and completing her afternoon duties, Eleanor approached Richard's home office where a rarely used computer sat on a side table. Richard had mentioned once that she could use it if needed, though in all these years she never had. Today was different. With careful fingers, she typed James Barrett Vanguard Development into the search engine. The results were illuminating. News articles, business profiles, and community forum posts painted a picture of a developer with a controversial history. Barrett's projects in Oakland, Detroit, and Atlanta had all faced community backlash and environmental concerns. One headline particularly caught her attention. Vanguard Development settles contamination lawsuit in Detroit. The article detailed how Barrett's company had paid a substantial settlement after chemicals from a development project had leaked into nearby groundwater. The terms included a non-disclosure agreement that prevented affected residents from discussing the case. Another article mentioned protests in Atlanta when a historic black neighborhood was demolished for a shopping complex, with residents claiming they had received far less compensation than promised. The project had moved forward despite the protests, with local officials praising the economic benefits while ignoring the displaced families. Eleanor printed several articles, folding them carefully and placing them in her handbag. As she closed the browser window, she heard the front door open, Richard returning from his meetings. She quickly shut down the computer and hurried to the kitchen, arriving just as Richard entered through the main hallway. Eleanor, I'll be in my study. Bring some coffee, please, he called out, sounding tired. Right away, sir, she replied, her heart still racing from the near discovery. When she brought the coffee to his study a few minutes later, Richard was on the phone, his voice tense. Yes, Barrett, I understand the urgency, but I need time to review everything properly. No, I'm not backing out. Yes, Friday is still our target for signing. Eleanor placed the coffee on his desk silently, noticing the deepening lines on Richard's face. For a moment their eyes met, and she thought she saw something there. Doubt, perhaps, or concern. Then he turned away, focusing on his call again. That evening, after finishing her duties, Eleanor drove straight to her sister's house in Riverside. The neighborhood looked different to her now, knowing what she did about its planned destruction. The old oak trees lining the streets, the community garden at the corner, the historic church with its bell tower, all of it marked for demolition in Barrett's plans. Patty welcomed her with a hug, noticing her sister's serious expression. What's wrong, Ellie? You look like you've seen a ghost. Inside, Eleanor shared what she had learned, showing Patty the printed articles about Barrett's previous projects. This can't be legal, Patty said, her voice shaking as she read about the Detroit contamination case. They can't just come in and destroy our homes. They can if they have the right connections and enough money, Eleanor replied grimly. And from what I've seen, Barrett has both. As they talked, neighbors began to arrive. Patty had called a few close friends after Eleanor's visit the previous night. Soon, Patty's small living room was filled with concerned Riverside residents, many of whom Eleanor had known since childhood. An older man named Howard, who had been a civil rights attorney before retiring, studied the articles Eleanor had brought. This is a familiar pattern, he said, his deep voice carrying authority. Target communities without political power. Move quickly before opposition can organize. Use economic arguments to win over officials. So what can we do? Asked a young woman holding a sleeping toddler. This is my grandmother's house. We can't afford to move. Howard adjusted his glasses. Information is power. We need to know exactly what they're planning, when they're planning it and who's backing them. Then we can decide how to fight back. All eyes turned to Eleanor, No one had asked directly about her source of information, but it was clear they understood she had access to something valuable. "I'll do what I can," she said quietly, conscious of the line she was crossing. "But we need to be careful. These people have resources we don't." By the time Eleanor left her sister's house, a loose plan had formed. Howard would research legal options for the community. Others would reach out to environmental groups who had fought similar developments. Someone knew a reporter at the local newspaper who might be interested in Barrett's history. As for Eleanor, her role was clear. She needed to learn more about the specifics of the deal Richard was about to sign. The next morning, Eleanor received a text from her nephew Thomas. "Found something, can meet at lunch." At noon, Eleanor met Thomas at a small cafe downtown, far from both the Montgomery Mansion and City Hall. Her normally cheerful nephew looked serious as he slid a folder across the table. "I could lose my job for this, Aunt Ellie," he said quietly, "but people need to know." Inside the folder were copies of permit applications, environmental waiver requests, and preliminary approvals for the Riverside project, all filed by Vanguard Development weeks before any public announcement. Most troubling was an environmental assessment that glossed over potential contamination risks, similar to those that had caused problems in Detroit. "There's more," Thomas said, leaning forward. "Barrett's company made substantial donations to several city council members' campaigns last year, including Wilson, and they hired the mayor's brother-in-law as a consultant 3 months ago." Eleanor felt sick. "So they've already bought the approval they need," Thomas nodded grimly. "Unless something changes, this is a done deal. The final zoning change is on next month's council agenda, but it's being presented as a technical adjustment, nothing that would alert the community." Eleanor thanked her nephew, promising to keep him out of whatever happened next. As she drove back to the mansion, the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming. Richard Montgomery was about to tie himself to a corrupt developer whose project would destroy her sister's community and potentially cause environmental damage, and she might be the only person who could stop it. When she arrived, Richard was meeting with his personal attorney in the study. Eleanor went about her afternoon tasks, her mind elsewhere. How could she convince Richard to reconsider without revealing how much she knew or how she knew it? As she dusted the hallway outside the study, she overheard fragments of conversation. "The HOA liability concerns me, Richard," the attorney was saying. "If these environmental projections are off even slightly, Barrett assures me everything is within regulations," Richard replied, though Eleanor could hear the doubt in his voice. "His assurances won't protect you if things go wrong. Your name will be on these documents too, not just his." The conversation shifted to legal details Eleanor couldn't follow, but one thing was clear. Richard's attorney had concerns about the deal. Perhaps Richard wasn't as convinced as Barrett wanted him to be. That evening, as Eleanor prepared to leave, Richard called her into the dining room, where he sat surrounded by contract documents and maps. "Eleanor, you mentioned your sister lives in Riverside," he said, surprising her with his memory of their brief conversation. "Yes, sir. For over 40 years now." Richard gestured to the chair across from him, something he had never done before. After a moment's hesitation, Eleanor sat down, perching uncomfortably on the edge of the seat. "This development would change that neighborhood completely," Richard said, his expression unreadable. "Progress requires change, but—" He trailed off, looking at the map spread before him. Eleanor chose her words carefully. "My sister's community has deep roots, sir. The church there was built by people who weren't allowed to worship elsewhere. The community garden feeds families who might otherwise go hungry. Progress is important, but so is history." Richard studied her face. "You've worked for me for 30 years, Eleanor. In all that time, you've never commented on my business decisions." "I've never known one that would affect my family directly," she replied simply. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Richard sighed. "Barrett is pushing hard for me to sign these contracts tomorrow. Once I do, everything moves quickly." Eleanor felt her heart race. Tomorrow. It was happening even faster than she had feared. "Sir," she began, then faltered. How could she tell him what she knew without revealing how she knew it? Richard was watching her curiously now. Is there something else, Eleanor? She stood up, smoothing her apron with trembling hands. It's important to be sure with decisions this big, to know exactly who you're dealing with. Richard's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. Yes, it is. Good night, Eleanor. Good night, sir. As Eleanor drove home, her mind was in turmoil. Richard seemed to have doubts, but would they be enough to make him reconsider? Or would Barrett's pressure and the promise of profits win out? One thing was certain. By this time tomorrow, the fate of Riverside would likely be decided. And Eleanor Jenkins, after 30 years of quiet service, faced the most important decision of her career. Should she remain silent and loyal to her employer, or should she speak out to protect her sister's community, even if it meant risking everything? As she pulled into her driveway, Eleanor knew she wouldn't be sleeping much tonight. Tomorrow would require courage she wasn't sure she possessed. But as she thought of her sister's home, the historic church, and all the families whose lives would be upended, she felt a resolve hardening within her. Sometimes, loyalty meant speaking hard truths, not keeping comfortable silences. Tomorrow, one way or another, Eleanor would find her voice. Eleanor woke before her alarm, the weight of the day ahead making sleep impossible. She dressed with extra care, choosing her best uniform, the crisp black dress and white apron she usually reserved for Richard's formal dinner parties. Today felt important, momentous in a way that required dignity. The drive to the Montgomery mansion was familiar, a route her car seemed to follow of its own accord after 30 years. But today Eleanor noticed details she usually missed, the way the morning light filtered through the trees, the children waiting for school buses, the small businesses opening their doors for the day. The ordinary rhythm of life that would soon be disrupted for hundreds of families if Barrett's plans moved forward. When she arrived, the house was quiet. Richard's car was gone, and a note on the kitchen counter informed her he had an early meeting, but would return by noon for his final review of the contracts. Barrett and his team would arrive at 2 o'clock for the signing. Eleanor went about, her morning duties mechanically, her mind elsewhere. She had spent half the night researching Barrett and Vanguard development, using her sister's computer to dig deeper than she had been able to at the mansion. What she discovered had only strengthened her resolve. A community newsletter from Atlanta described how Barrett had promised to preserve historic buildings, only to demolish them once permits were secured. Court records from Michigan detailed environmental violations that had sickened residents near a Vanguard project. Most disturbing was a pattern of using political connections to silence opposition, including having protest permits mysteriously revoked and critical news coverage suddenly dropped. Eleanor had printed these articles too, adding them to the folder she now carried in her handbag. But would evidence be enough? Would Richard listen to his housekeeper over a powerful businessman promising millions in profits? As she dusted the study, Eleanor paused before Richard's desk, noticing the contract. Folders arranged neatly, waiting for signatures. This was what 30 years of loyalty had earned her, the right to clean the pen that would sign away her sister's home. The sound of a car in the driveway pulled Eleanor from her thoughts. Richard was back earlier than expected. She quickly finished dusting and headed to the kitchen to prepare his lunch. "Eleanor," Richard called as he entered the house. "Are you here?" "In the kitchen, sir," she replied, surprised by the tension in his voice. Richard appeared in the doorway, looking troubled. His meeting with Barrett had clearly not gone well. He loosened his tie and sat heavily at the kitchen table, something he rarely did. "Barrett is bringing the final contracts at 2, he said, more to himself than to Eleanor. "Everything moves quickly after that." Eleanor placed a cup of coffee before him, noting the deep lines of worry on his face. "You seem concerned, sir." Richard looked up as if suddenly remembering she was there. For a moment he seemed about to dismiss her, then sighed. "Barrett's investors are pushing hard. There are aspects of this deal that feel rushed." It was the opening Eleanor had been waiting for, but now that the moment had arrived, she hesitated. 30 years of keeping her opinions to herself made speaking out feel almost physically impossible. Would you like your lunch in the dining room, sir? She asked instead, falling back on the comfortable routine. Here is fine, Richard replied, surprising her again. Sometimes I think I spend too much time in that study, surrounded by papers, instead of people. As Eleanor prepared a simple lunch, she could feel Richard watching her, his mind clearly elsewhere. When she placed the plate before him, he spoke again. Your sister has lived in Riverside for 40 years, you said? Eleanor nodded, her heart beginning to race. Yes, sir. Her husband worked at the steel mill until it closed. They raised 3 children there. My nephew Thomas works at City Hall now. And the community there? It's important to them? The neighborhood itself, I mean. Eleanor met his eyes directly. It's everything to them, sir. When other areas wouldn't sell homes to black families, Riverside welcomed them. When banks wouldn't give loans, neighbors helped each other build. The church there was built by hand by people who weren't allowed through the doors of other churches. Richard nodded slowly, pushing his food around his plate. Barrett says progress requires change, that communities adapt. Some changes can't be adapted to, sir. Some things, once lost, can't be replaced. A heavy silence fell between them. Richard ate a few bites, then pushed his plate away. I should review the contracts one more time before Barrett arrives. He stood and headed toward the study, then paused in the doorway. Thank you, Eleanor, for the lunch and for speaking. Honestly, Eleanor cleared away the barely touched meal, her mind racing. Richard seemed troubled by the deal, but would that be enough? Barrett was clearly a powerful persuader, and the profits at stake were enormous. She needed to do more, to say more before it was too late. As 1 o'clock approached, Eleanor made a decision. Taking a deep breath, she removed the folder of articles from her handbag and walked to Richard's study. She knocked softly on the half-open door. Come in, Richard called, not looking up from the contract spread across his desk. Eleanor entered, clutching the folder tightly. Sir, I've brought your afternoon tea. Richard glanced up, noticing she carried no tea tray. His eyebrows rose slightly as he took in her serious expression and the folder in her hands. What's this, Eleanor? She stepped forward, placing the folder on his desk. Information about Mr. Barrett and his company that you should see before signing anything. Richard stared at her in astonishment. In 30 years, Eleanor had never done anything like this. She had never overstepped the careful boundaries between employer and employee. I don't understand, he said finally. Eleanor's heart pounded so hard she was sure Richard could hear it. Mr. Barrett hasn't been honest with you, sir, about the environmental risks, about how he handles community opposition, about what happened with his previous projects. Richard's expression darkened. How would you know what Barrett has or hasn't told me? Because I've researched him, sir, Eleanor replied, her voice steadier than she felt. After I heard him talking about my sister's neighborhood like it was nothing but land to be cleared. After I realized what his plans would mean for hundreds of families. Richard's face registered shock, then anger. You've been investigating. My business partner? Going through my private business matters? No, sir, Eleanor said quickly. I used public information, news articles, court records. Anyone could find these things. I'm just not sure you've had the chance to look beyond what Mr. Barrett has shown you. Richard stared at her for a long moment, then slowly opened the folder. Eleanor stood silently as he reviewed the articles, his expression growing more troubled with each page. The Detroit contamination case, he murmured. Barrett mentioned a minor environmental issue that was blown out of proportion. 16 children were hospitalized, sir, Eleanor said quietly. The settlement included lifetime medical monitoring for the affected families. Richard continued, reading, his frown deepening. When he looked up again, the anger had been replaced by something else. Uncertainty, perhaps even fear. Why are you showing me this, Eleanor? You've never involved yourself in my business before. Because this isn't just business, sir, it's people's lives. My sister's life. And... She hesitated, then continued. Because I believe you're a better man than Mr. Barrett thinks you are. Richard's expression softened slightly. Even after 30 years of watching me make deals that sometimes hurt communities, that put profit first? I've also seen you support the Children's Hospital anonymously. Heard you refuse deals that cross certain lines. You're a businessman, sir, but you've never been cruel. Richard fell silent, looking down at the articles. Again. Eleanor stood perfectly still, aware that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. Whatever happened next, her relationship with Richard Montgomery had changed forever. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 1:30. Barrett would arrive in 30 minutes. Richard closed the folder and stood up. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Eleanor. I need to make some calls before Barrett arrives. His tone was unreadable. Eleanor couldn't tell if he was angry, grateful, or simply dismissing her. She nodded and turned to leave. Eleanor, Richard called as she reached the door. She looked back. Why did you wait until today? You could have shown me this yesterday or the day before. She met his gaze steadily. Because I hoped I wouldn't have to, sir. I hoped you would see for yourself what kind of man Mr. Barrett is. Richard nodded slowly. 30 years, and I'm still learning things about you. As am I about you, sir, she replied quietly, then left the study, closing the door behind her. The next 30 minutes were the longest of Eleanor's life. She busied herself in the kitchen preparing tea and coffee for the upcoming meeting, all the while straining to hear any sound from Richard's study. She could hear his voice occasionally, clearly on the phone, but couldn't make out the words. At exactly 2:00, the doorbell rang. Eleanor smoothed her apron and went to answer it. Barrett stood on the doorstep, flanked by his lawyer and the woman with the laptop from the previous meeting. His confidence seemed to radiate from him like heat. Good afternoon, Ms. Jenkins, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I believe Mr. Montgomery is expecting us. Eleanor nodded politely. Please come in. Mr. Montgomery is in his study. I'll show you in. She led the group down the hallway, knocking on the study door before opening it. Richard sat behind his desk, his expression carefully neutral. Mr. Barrett and his associates, sir, Eleanor announced formally. Thank you, Eleanor, Richard replied, his voice giving nothing away. Please bring in the tea and coffee. Barrett strode forward confidently, hand outstretched. Today's the day, Richard. Once these papers are signed, we make history, and a lot of money. Eleanor retreated to the kitchen, her hands trembling as she arranged the tea service. Had her intervention made any difference? Or had Richard decided the profits outweighed the concerns? She couldn't bear to think of facing her sister if the deal went through. When she returned with the tea tray, the atmosphere in the study had changed. Barrett was speaking rapidly, his earlier confidence replaced by an edge of desperation. These last-minute concerns are unnecessary, Richard. We've addressed all the environmental requirements. The community impact is minimal compared to the benefits. Richard's face remained impassive. Your previous project in Detroit faced similar questions, I believe, before the contamination was discovered. Barrett shot a quick glance at Eleanor as she set down the tea tray. His eyes narrowed slightly before returning to Richard. Minor issues, greatly exaggerated by a few vocal opponents. Every major project faces some resistance. 16 hospitalized children doesn't sound minor to me, Richard replied quietly. The room fell silent. Barrett's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, while the woman with the laptop stared fixedly at her screen. Eleanor began pouring tea, her movements deliberate and calm despite her racing heart. Barrett leaned forward, lowering his voice. Look, Richard, I don't know what you've heard, but we have a deal. The other investors are committed. The political pieces are in place. This train is leaving the station with or without Montgomery Properties. Then it will have to leave without me, Richard said firmly, pushing the contract folders away. I'm not signing these papers, Barrett. The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor nearly dropped the teacup she was holding, catching it just in time. Barrett's face flushed red, his confident facade crumbling. You can't back out now, he hissed. We have verbal agreements. The investors are counting on your participation. Verbal agreements aren't contracts, Richard replied calmly. And I've spent the last hour on the phone with those investors, sharing some interesting information about your previous projects they weren't aware of. Barrett stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "You're making a serious mistake, Montgomery. This deal would have made you millions. It would also have destroyed a historic community and potentially created environmental hazards that could harm hundreds of people," Richard countered, rising to face Barrett. "That's not a trade I'm willing to make." Barrett's eyes darted to Eleanor, who was quietly arranging cookies on a plate. "I see what's happening here. You're letting your maid's personal connections cloud your business judgment." Richard's expression hardened. "Eleanor has worked for me for 30 years, Barrett. In all that time, she's shown more integrity than you've demonstrated in our brief acquaintance. If her concerns helped me see what kind of man you really are, then I'm grateful for her insight." Barrett gathered his papers angrily, nodding for his team to do the same. "You'll regret this, Montgomery. I have friends in this city who won't be pleased." "So do I," Richard replied evenly, "including a very interested district attorney who's reviewing those environmental reports from Detroit as we speak." The color drained from Barrett's face. Without another word, he stormed out of the study, his team hurrying after him. The front door slammed moments later, rattling the windows. Eleanor stood frozen by the tea tray, hardly able to believe what had just happened. Richard remained standing behind his desk, watching her with an unreadable expression. "Well," he said finally, "I believe that's the first time in 30 years I've seen you spill a drop of tea, Eleanor." She looked down at the small puddle on the tray, a nervous laugh escaping her. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll clean it up right away." "Leave it," Richard said, coming around the desk. "I think we both deserve a moment to process what just happened." He gestured to the chair across from his desk, the same invitation he had extended the previous evening, but now with a different weight behind it. Eleanor sat down carefully, her legs suddenly unsteady. Richard returned to his chair, studying her face. 30 years of perfect discretion, and today you decided to intervene in what might have been the biggest deal of my career. Why today, Eleanor? She met his gaze directly. "Because today was the day you were going to sign those papers, sir, and some silences become betrayals if kept too long." Richard nodded slowly, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "You took an enormous risk. I could have fired you on the spot." "Yes, sir, you could have," Eleanor agreed quietly. "But my sister's home, her community, they're worth the risk." "And what about your home? Your livelihood?" Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap, but her voice remained steady. "Some things matter more than security, sir. Some moments require us to stand up even when we're afraid." Richard leaned back in his chair, a smile slowly spreading across his face. 30 years, Eleanor, 30 years, and I never truly saw you until today." Outside the study window, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn. In the distance, a church bell rang, perhaps from the very church in Riverside that had been marked for demolition in Barrett's plans. "What happens now, sir?" Eleanor asked softly. Richard's smile faded, replaced by thoughtful determination. "Now, Eleanor, we have work to do. Real work, not Barrett's kind of deal. Riverside doesn't need to be destroyed to be improved. Perhaps Montgomery Properties can find a better way, one that builds up the community rather than tearing it down." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, quickly blinking them away. "That would mean a great deal to the people there, sir." "And to you?" Richard asked, watching her closely. "Yes, sir. To me as well." Richard nodded as if coming to a decision. "I think it's time you and I had a proper conversation, Eleanor. After 30 years, I believe we've earned it." As the afternoon light filled the study, Eleanor Jenkins and Richard Montgomery began to talk, really talk, for the first time. Employer and employee, certainly, but now something else as well. Two people who had shared a house for decades but only now were truly seeing each other. Two people who had just changed the course of many lives, including their own. Outside, a car drove past the mansion gates heading toward Riverside, perhaps carrying the news that the shadow of destruction had passed, at least for now. Eleanor thought of her sister, of the church, of all the families whose futures had hung in the balance today. "Don't sign that deal," she had warned, finding courage she never knew she possessed. and Richard Montgomery had listened, proving that sometimes the quietest voice in the room could be the most important one of all. The news spread through Riverside like wildfire. The development project that had threatened to uproot hundreds of families had been suddenly, unexpectedly canceled. Rumors swirled about why. Some said the financing had fallen through. Others claimed environmental concerns had halted the plans. Only Eleanor Jenkins knew the full truth, and she kept most of it to herself, sharing only what was necessary with her sister Patty. "All I know is Mr. Montgomery decided not to partner with Barrett," she told Patty over dinner the week after the confrontation. "He had concerns about the environmental impact and the community disruption." Patty studied her sister's face, sensing there was more to the story. "And you had nothing to do with this sudden change of heart?" Eleanor smiled slightly. "I may have provided some information that helped him make his decision." "Ellie Jenkins," Patty said, shaking her head in wonder. "After all these years of never bringing your work home or talking about that man you work for, you went and saved our neighborhood." "Mr. Montgomery made the decision," Eleanor insisted. "He could have ignored me completely." "But he didn't," Patty pointed out. "After 30 years of you being invisible in that big house, he finally saw you." Eleanor couldn't deny that something fundamental had changed between her and Richard Montgomery. The day after Barrett stormed out, Richard had called her into his study again, but this time not to dust or deliver tea. He wanted her opinion on something. "I've been thinking about Riverside," he had said, spreading a map across his desk. Barrett was right about one thing. The area could benefit from investment, but not his kind of investment. Eleanor had stood awkwardly until Richard gestured impatiently at the chair. "Sit down, Eleanor. If we're going to talk about this properly, you can't be hovering there like you're about to dash off to polish something." Hesitantly, she had taken a seat, feeling strange to be sitting across from her employer, as if they were equals. "Tell me about Riverside," Richard had said. "Not the real estate values or zoning potential. Tell me about the community, what it needs, what matters to the people there." That conversation had been the first of many. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor found herself in an entirely new role, still managing the Montgomery household, but also providing insights and perspectives Richard had never considered before. Now, a month after Barrett's defeat, Eleanor arrived at work to find Richard waiting for her in the kitchen, an unusual occurrence that still surprised her despite their changing relationship. "Good morning," he said, looking up from his tablet. "I have a meeting in Riverside today. I'd like you to come with me." Eleanor paused in the act of hanging up her coat. "To Riverside? May I ask why, sir?" Richard had tried repeatedly to get her to call him by his first name, but some habits were too deeply ingrained to break easily. "I'm meeting with the community council to discuss my proposal," he explained. "Your sister will be there, I believe, along with the pastor from the church and several other community leaders." Eleanor felt a flutter of anxiety. "What proposal is this, sir?" Richard smiled. "The Riverside Community Development Fund. I've been working on it for weeks. Surely you've noticed all those late-night calls and meetings." Of course she had. Noticed. Richard had been unusually busy, with a stream of visitors that included city planners, architects, and financial advisors. But he hadn't shared the details with her, and she hadn't felt it was her place to ask. The fund will provide low-interest loans for local businesses, grants for home repairs and historic preservation, and investment in community spaces like the church and that garden you mentioned, Richard continued. "No one gets displaced, no historic buildings get demolished, and the community itself has a controlling voice in how the money is used." Eleanor stared at him, momentarily speechless. This was as far from Barrett's destructive development plan as possible, a vision of growth that preserved what made Riverside special while addressing its genuine needs. "That sounds wonderful," she said finally. "But why do you want me at the meeting?" Richard's expression grew serious. "Because none of this would exist without you, Eleanor. Because you had the courage to speak up when it mattered most. And because I'm offering you a position as community liaison for the fund if you want it." Eleanor's hand flew to her throat in surprise. "A position? I don't understand." You'd work with the community council to evaluate proposals, identify needs, and ensure the fund is serving the people it's meant to help, Richard explained. You know Riverside better than anyone I could hire, and the people there trust you. You'd be perfect for it. But what about? Eleanor gestured vaguely around the kitchen, at the home she had maintained for 3 decades. You'd still manage the household if you want to, Richard said, but with help. It's time I hired additional staff anyway. This place is too big for one person to handle alone, no matter how capable you are. Or, he added, watching her carefully, you could focus entirely on the new role. It would come with a substantial increase in salary, of course. Eleanor sank slowly into a kitchen chair, overwhelmed by the offer. After 30 years of invisible service, of quiet observation from the margins, she was being invited to step into the center, to have a voice in decisions that would shape her own community's future. I don't know what to say, she admitted. Say you'll at least come to the meeting, Richard replied. See what you think, talk to your sister and the others, then decide. 3 hours later, Eleanor found herself sitting in the basement of Riverside Baptist Church, the heart of the community she had grown up in. The wood-paneled room was filled with familiar faces, neighbors, friends, her sister Patty in the front row. At the center was Pastor Wallace, who had led the congregation for over 20 years, his kind face serious as he called the meeting to order. Richard Montgomery looked distinctly out of place in his expensive suit, the only white face in a room of black community leaders. Yet he spoke with a humility that surprised Eleanor, explaining his proposal without the usual business jargon, listening more than talking, answering questions directly and honestly. Why should we trust you? Asked Howard, the retired civil rights attorney. Your company has bought and developed plenty of properties before. What makes Riverside different? Richard glanced at Eleanor before answering. Frankly, someone I respect greatly helped me see that there's more than one way to measure success in business. I've spent decades focusing on financial returns while ignoring the human costs. Riverside is an opportunity to do better, to show that development doesn't have to mean destruction. And this community liaison position, Pastor Wallace said, you mentioned Eleanor Jenkins would take on this role. All eyes turned to Eleanor, who felt her cheeks warm under the scrutiny. I've offered the position to Ms. Jenkins, Richard confirmed, but she hasn't accepted yet. She wanted to hear from all of you first, which I think speaks volumes about where her priorities lie. The meeting continued for nearly 2 hours with tough questions, skeptical comments, and gradually cautious optimism. Throughout it all, Eleanor watched her employer, this man she had served for 30 years but was only now beginning to truly know, handle himself with unexpected grace and sincerity. When it was over, people lingered in small groups discussing the proposal. Richard found himself deep in conversation with Pastor Wallace and 2 small business owners. Eleanor stood to the side, observing as she had done her entire career, when her sister approached. So, Patty said, linking her arm through Eleanor's. Community liaison, huh? That's quite a change from making beds and serving tea. Eleanor smiled. I haven't said yes yet. But you will, Patty stated confidently. I saw your face when he was explaining the fund. You were already making plans, thinking about who could benefit, how it could work. Eleanor couldn't deny it. Her mind had been racing with possibilities. The Johnson family whose roof was badly in need of repair. The talented young chef who dreamed of opening a restaurant but couldn't get a traditional bank loan. The church's music program that had been surviving on shoestring donations. It's hard to imagine doing something else after all these years, Eleanor admitted. The mansion has been my whole world for so long. Maybe it's time your world got bigger, Patty suggested gently. Across the room, Richard caught Eleanor's eye and gestured her over to join his conversation with Pastor Wallace. As she approached, she heard the pastor saying, We've been trying to restore the stained glass windows for years, but the cost is prohibitive. That sounds exactly like the kind of project the fund could support, Richard replied. Eleanor, what do you think? The church windows would be a good place to start, wouldn't they? The casual way he included her, valuing her opinion, still felt strange after decades of near invisibility. But as she joined the conversation, offering her thoughts and seeing them received with genuine interest, Eleanor felt something shift. Inside her, a wall coming down, a door opening. On the drive back to the mansion, Richard was unusually quiet, his expression thoughtful. Eleanor, too, was lost in reflection, the events of the past month still feeling somewhat unreal. "They liked the proposal," Richard said finally, breaking the silence. "More than I expected, honestly." "They're cautious," Eleanor replied. "Riverside has been promised things before that never materialized. But yes, I think they're hopeful." Richard nodded. "And you? Have you thought about the position?" Eleanor gazed out the window at the familiar streets passing by. The Montgomery mansion appeared in the distance, grand and imposing as ever. For 30 years it had been her workplace, the backdrop to a life spent in service to others. "Yes," she said quietly. "I'd like to accept. But I'd also like to continue managing the household, at least for now. With help, as you suggested." Richard smiled. "I think that can be arranged. We'll hire an assistant for you right away." As they pulled into the driveway, Eleanor found herself seeing the mansion with new eyes, not just as a workplace but as a symbol of the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. From invisible housekeeper to valued advisor, from silence to voice. "You know," Richard said as they walked to the front door, "when you stopped me from signing that deal with Barrett, I was angry at first. No one had ever interfered in my business decisions before." "I remember," Eleanor said with a small smile. "But later that night, after Barrett left, I realized something." Richard paused, his hand on the door handle. "In 30 years of making deals, signing contracts, building this business, no one had ever simply told me the truth because it was the right thing to do. Everyone had an angle, something to gain. Everyone except you." Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I had something to gain too. My sister's home. Her community." "Yes, but you risked everything to protect others." Richard shook his head slightly. "It made me wonder how many other deals I'd made without seeing the full picture, without hearing the voices of the people most affected." They entered the mansion together, but instead of heading to the kitchen as she normally would, Eleanor found herself following Richard to his study, not to clean or serve, but to continue their conversation, to plan for the future of Riverside. 6. Months later, Eleanor Jenkins sat in a folding chair on the lawn of Riverside Baptist Church, watching as Pastor Wallace cut a ribbon stretched across the entrance. Above him, the newly restored stained glass windows gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, their vibrant colors casting rainbow patterns on the gathering crowd. The first of many projects supported by the Riverside Community Development Fund, the pastor announced proudly. A partnership that proves progress doesn't have to come at the expense of history. Beside Eleanor, Richard Montgomery applauded along with everyone else, looking more relaxed than she had ever seen him. In the month since the fund's creation, he had become a familiar figure in Riverside, not as a developer to be feared, but as a partner in the community's growth. On Eleanor's other side sat her new assistant, a young woman named Letitia, who now handled many of the day-to-day tasks at the mansion. Eleanor still oversaw the household, but her role as community liaison had quickly become her primary focus. 3 days a week, she worked from a small office in Riverside, meeting with residents, reviewing applications for funding, and ensuring the community's voice remained at the center of all decisions. After the ribbon-cutting ceremony, people gathered for a celebration on the church lawn. Eleanor moved through the crowd, greeting neighbors and friends, many of whom still expressed amazement at her transformation from quiet housekeeper to respected community leader. "I always knew you had it in you," her sister Patty said, handing her a glass of lemonade. "Even when you were just the help at that big house, I saw how you watched everything, noticed everything. You were never really invisible. You were waiting." "Waiting for what?" Eleanor asked. "The right moment," Patty replied simply. "The moment when speaking up mattered most." Across the lawn, Eleanor spotted Richard in conversation with Howard and several other community elders. The retired attorney who had once questioned Richard's motives was now showing him photographs of the neighborhood from decades past, pointing out buildings and landmarks with animated gestures. The scene would have been unimaginable a year ago. Richard Montgomery, wealthy businessman, listening intently to the stories of Riverside elders, genuinely interested in the history he had nearly helped destroy. As if sensing her gaze, Richard looked up and caught Eleanor's eye. He smiled and nodded slightly, an acknowledgement of the journey they had taken together. From employer and employee to something neither of them could have predicted. Eleanor returned the nod, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. The mansion was still there, still part of her life. But now her world extended beyond its walls, encompassing the community she had always loved, but could now actively serve. That evening, as Eleanor drove home from the celebration, she thought about the words she had spoken in Richard's study 6 months earlier, the words that had changed everything. "Don't sign that deal," she had said, finding courage in a moment of truth. 3 simple words from a woman who had spent decades in silence. 3 words that had saved a community, transformed a business relationship, and in the process, changed her own life in ways she never could have imagined. As the sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, Eleanor Jenkins drove toward the Montgomery mansion with a heart full of gratitude. The invisible woman had found her voice, and in doing so had helped others find theirs as well. Sometimes, she reflected, the quietest person in the room has the most important thing to say, if only they find the courage to say it.